In this video, we're going to be looking at diffusion. We're going to look at a definition of diffusion. We're going to look at why diffusion is described as being passive. We're going to look at what a concentration gradient is. We're also going to talk about the various factors which affect the rate of diffusion. We're going to be talking about Fick's law. And we're also going to be thinking about how facilitated diffusion differs from standard diffusion. So here we have the worksheet that you'll be filling in to accompany this video. So it starts off by saying cells need to be able to exchange substances with their surroundings in order to survive. These substances could be nutrients, hormones, enzymes, excreted materials and toxins, and so on. So we need to think about how this is achieved. In this video, we're going to be concerned with the first of the passive processes that I'd like to talk about, and this process is diffusion. All molecules are in a constant state of motion, as long as they're above absolute zero. This means that they possess kinetic energy. So that's energy as a result of their motion. This is the only energy required for passive processes to occur. So if we have a look at the diagram I've provided there, you can see a colored sugar cube. So it's been dyed using some sort of purple dye. And initially, when it's dropped into the water, it starts off very concentrated in the area it was dropped in. And then slowly, the particles spread out, and then eventually all of the water turns purple. So let's talk about that. What eventually happened in this situation? Number one, the colored particles spread out in the water. Eventually, all of the water turned purple. Okay, so that's a brief illustration of how diffusion works. So we need to talk about why this happens. This happens because the molecules are in a constant state of motion, and so they tend to spread out and use up all the space. Okay, so that's the first page done. We're now going to look further into diffusion. So we need a definition of diffusion, and you may be asked this in something like an exam or a test. So let's think about this. How would we define diffusion? Diffusion is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So notice that I used the term net movement. So let's think about what net movement actually means. All of the particles are moving randomly. Therefore, some of the particles are moving away from where they began, and some are moving back. Overall, most of the particles are going to be moving away from where they began. And that's why we say a net movement. Most are moving away, a small number are moving back inwards. But overall, the pattern is that the molecules are moving away from where they began to take up as much space as possible. So in diffusion, molecules move down their concentration gradient, and that's what we were talking about earlier. So the concentration gradient is the difference in concentration from one area to another. So they're moving down their concentration gradient because they're going from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So the concentration gradient is the difference between the concentrations of particles from one area to the next. It's moving down the gradient. Okay, it's important that you use the term moving down the gradient rather than saying moving along the gradient. For things like mark schemes in exams, using the phrase going along the concentration gradient will not get you the marks. You've got to say moving down a concentration gradient. Okay, so let's have a look at the next page. So we're going to mix things up a little bit. Here, we're going to be looking at diffusion, which involves a membrane. So you can see in this picture that there is a membrane between two sides, and there are two types of particles involved, small purple ones and large red ones. There are some questions within the picture which I would like us to answer right now. So have a quick look and a quick think about it. You might want to pause the video for a second and attempt to answer the questions, and then we'll go through it together. So you may pause the video right now. Okay, so what do you notice about the diagram? So let's start off with that. And we've already sort of mentioned that. There are two types of particles on either side of the membrane. Small purple ones and large red ones. Okay, so the next question was, why aren't there any big red dots on the right side of the membrane? So let's have a look at that. In essence, we're trying to think what the difference is between the different particles. There are no red dots on the right hand side because they are too large to pass through. Okay, so the final question on the top says, based on this picture, what are some characteristics of particles that can diffuse across a membrane? So one of the main characteristics to consider is the size of the particles involved. So as you saw, only the smaller particles were able to pass through, whereas the larger particles were too large and couldn't get through. So now we're going to look at the second set of questions. In this case, you should probably pause now. Now that you've had a chance to consider the questions, let's work through it. So what is this a picture of? And you can see there it's two rows of molecules. This is called a phospholipid bilayer. So the picture or diagram shows a phospholipid bilayer. And that's a component, in fact the main component of cell membranes. Okay, so let's have a look up here, back at the questions. What do you see that suggests particles could diffuse across it? And you can see, if we look here, the particles can diffuse across, probably because there's space in between the phospholipids. The particles can cross the bilayer because there is space between the phospholipids. Okay, And now let's think about the last question. What types of particles would be most likely to diffuse across? So we're going to consider two different things here, either very small particles or lipid soluble particles. For example, other lipids. Okay, so those were the answers to the questions. How well did you do? Next, we're going to consider how three factors affect the rate of diffusion or osmosis. So I mentioned osmosis here. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion which we will talk about in a second video after this video. So in this video, we're only really going to be concerned with the first 5 pages of the worksheet. So we're going to look at how 3 different factors affect the rate of diffusion. You should pause the video again and think about these 3 factors and try to figure out how they would affect the rate of diffusion. Pause now. Okay, so you've had a chance to think about these different factors. Let's work through what their effects would be. So the difference in concentration between 2 solutions or between 2 areas. So basically the difference in concentration from the area in which the particles began to the area in which, or the area they're moving towards. As the difference in concentration increases, so does the rate of diffusion. And that would be described as being directly proportional. The next thing we're going to consider is the thickness of the diffusion surface. Basically, the distance that the particles need to travel through the membrane. As the thickness of the diffusion surface increases, the rate of diffusion decreases. And this would be indirectly proportional or inversely proportional. Okay, there's one more to go. The surface area of the diffusion surface. As the surface area available for diffusion increases, so does the rate. Yet again, in this case, as in the first example, this would be described as being directly proportional. So these relationships between these factors and the rate of diffusion form the basis of something called Fick's law. So we're going to state what Fick's law is down below in the space provided. So on top, we're going to have the factors that increase alongside the rate of diffusion, and then on the bottom we're going to have the factor which as it increases causes a decrease in the rate of diffusion. So think about that for a second, pause it. Okay, let's see what we think the answer is. So we've got factors 1 and 3 being directly proportional. So those will go on the top. So difference in concentration multiplied by the surface area available. And that leaves one other variable or one other factor, and that's the thickness of the diffusion surface, which will go on the bottom. So thickness of diffusion surface. Okay, so on to the final page, or at least the final page that we're going to be considering today. We need to think about some keywords which will come up quite often in questions on this topic. So let's think why the following would be able to diffuse across membranes. Let's start off with lipids. So you may or may not know what a lipid is. Lipids are fats and oils. So now we need to think about why they can diffuse across membranes. Lipids are similar in structure to phospholipids and can pass through the bilayer directly. Next, let's think about very small molecules and ions. These can pass through the membranes because they are small enough to move through the gaps between phospholipids. Now let's think about another version of diffusion, what we describe as facilitated diffusion. And it's described as facilitated diffusion because something enables the process to happen. So this is facilitated because it uses protein pores in the membrane. It does not require ATP or energy. So still like standard diffusion, it just needs the energy from the particles themselves. And examples of situations where this would be necessary would be, say for instance, ions trying to move through, or very large molecules used for larger particles or ions. Now, ions will be repelled by the tails of those phospholipids we looked at earlier, and as such, you need to have a way to get them past the membrane, and using protein pores would do that. So you'd use facilitated diffusion. So is facilitated diffusion an active or a passive process? I'll give you a second to think about that. Pause the video. Okay, so let's see what you think. If you had said it was an active process, you would be wrong. It's still a passive process, as I already alluded to earlier. So facilitated diffusion is a passive process. So does it require any energy beyond the kinetic energy of the molecules involved? No. So no, it does not require any ATP or energy beyond that possessed by the particles moving. Okay, so that is everything that we're going to be looking at with regard to diffusion. In the next video, we'll be looking at osmosis, which is a special form of diffusion, and we'll talk more about that next time. So let's look at what we've been talking about in this lesson, and we'll be looking at a brief summary of what we discussed. So first, we started off with a definition of diffusion. Diffusion is the net movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, basically down their concentration gradient. Remember what I said earlier, it's important to say down the concentration gradient rather than along the concentration gradient. Down gets you the mark, along does not. Next, we talked about diffusion being a passive process. Basically, it just uses the energy of the particles involved, because all particles are in constant motion, and as such, you don't need any extra energy for diffusion to take place. You don't need ATP, for instance. And then finally, we talked about how various factors affect the rate of diffusion. So, for instance, if you have a high surface area for diffusion to take place, diffusion will happen much faster. Whereas if you have a very thick diffusion surface, because the particles have to travel a longer distance to get across, the rate of diffusion will slow down. All of that is represented in something called Fick's law, which if you go back through the worksheet we've just done, you would be able to find that relationship. So that's it on diffusion. As usual, you should go back over the video, watch it as often as you need to for everything to sink in, fill in the worksheet, and over time test yourself. See if you can refill the worksheet over and over again without looking at the information at your disposal, like this video or any of your notes. If you found this useful, it would help if you liked the video below, and if you want to be notified whenever there are new videos available, click on the subscribe button. Thank you very much, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.